I want to welcome you to the third in our series of lectures on the theme of ways and knowing. I think you'll agree that we're off to an excellent start with this series. If you remember, those of you who were with us on the first night, Gary Hawk led us in a careful and close consideration of the Hebrew Bible's Job and his suffering and the conjunction of suffering and meaning and transcendence. And I think everyone found that a difficult but wonderful experience. After that, Ron Perrin, who's also here again tonight, thanks for coming, Ron, talked to us last week about two different ways of knowing, or maybe two different ways of questioning, which can be traced right through our Western tradition, the mythological and the philosophical. And tonight you're in for a real treat, a lecture by Professor John Glendenning on the topic, Darwin and Other Apes, Climbing the Tree of Life. Darwin's not here, so we can say those things about him. Professor Glendenning is a member of the English faculty and has been here for 14 years. We both arrived on this campus in 1992. After receiving his doctorate at Indiana University, Professor Glendenning taught at several different universities, mostly in the Midwest, and then also for 10 years at a private high school in Santa Fe, New Mexico. During his years here, he's not only carried a full teaching load and done that very successfully, but also published numerous articles and a book called The High Road, Romantic Tourism, Scotland and Literature, 1720 to 1820, and directed his department's undergraduate and graduate literature programs, but has also been very active in the broader community. I know John very well from several years of work together in the Liberal Studies program, and he has been teaching in the Ways of Knowing series since its inception. You will soon see why our students and we colleagues are so pleased that he's been able to carve out time and energy for us from this busy, busy life of departmental contributions. We asked every speaker to give us a little piece of interesting information about himself, and I don't know whether John thought what he gave me was interesting or not. He said he was married. I thought that was interesting. He said he had one daughter. He has a wonderful daughter. There are 2 dogs, a cat, a partridge, and a pear tree, and so on. But what I noticed is that he got his BA at Wabash College. Any other graduates from Wabash College here? No, because this college name has come to my attention a few times recently. Some of you were at the debate we had on academic freedom a couple of weeks ago on the campus, and Roger Bowen, who is the General Secretary of AAUP, hails from Wabash College in Indiana, right, John? And also a fellow named Dan Simmons, who has written a couple of wonderful sci-fi novels. And I never read sci-fi, but these are about classics, so I read those. And of course, John is one of my favorite people, so I'm beginning to think there's something good about Wabash College. In any case, I'm pleased to give to you this evening, John, I may go there on a sabbatical or something. I have one next year. In any case, I'm honored to give to you this evening Professor John Glendenning with his remarks on Darwin and Other Apes, Climbing the Tree of Life. John.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you. When I was asked for the title of my lecture late last year, I came up with the title that you heard. And as best I can remember, my thought was that it might be a little bit provocative and a little bit obscure. When I finally got around to actually writing my lecture a couple of years ago, it had become rather obscure for me. But I think I've reconstructed what I had in mind pretty much, and I'll eventually get around to the relevance of that title. But I'm going to start on another tack. As best I can tell, in most parts of the world, Darwinism is largely uncontroversial, even for religious people. a population that in this country includes those most likely to dismiss or oppose it, although certainly not all religious Americans reject evolution. As far as I can tell, in Catholic countries there seems relatively little resistance, and indeed, on several occasions, the Vatican has pronounced that there is no inherent conflict between belief in evolution and belief in Catholicism. In the United States, attitudes towards evolution are far less accommodating, as we know. My particular focus and area of expertise regarding evolutionary theory, Darwinian versions and others as well, concerns how it affected late Victorian culture and literature in Britain. One thing I've recognized, a topic about which I'll have more to say, is how in this country current dismissals of evolution in general and of Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection in particular, for the most part echo criticisms, many of them religiously based, made over a century ago in Britain. Darwin was an Englishman who was honored by being buried in Westminster Abbey alongside other cultural giants, an action that prefigured the eventual triumph of his ideas in England, throughout Europe, but not here in the United States, where polls indicate that the majority of Americans actually reject evolution, even though professional biologists are convinced that evolution occurs, and does so largely, if not exclusively, in a Darwinian fashion. In the Ways of Knowing course at UM's Honors College, we explore the question of how we know reality, more specifically how we know nature, society, the self, and the divine. When we teach Darwin's writings and ideas, we get a double payoff. Like other texts that loomed large in the course, the Old and New Testaments and writings by Aristotle, Plato, Descartes, Marx, Freud, and others who have greatly influenced how we know, Darwin's texts are vital for understanding our historical and cultural background and for exploring the question of how we know, or what we think we know. Love them or loathe them, Darwin's theories have seeped into and helped fashion the intellectual landscape we occupy today, influencing, sometimes almost invisibly, our ways of knowing. What separates Darwin and Darwinism, however, from most of the other authors and texts we read and discuss in the course, is that these subjects in America are major hot-button issues. Go to any large bookstore and you'll find shelves loaded with books explaining, supporting, and, in somewhat lesser numbers, attacking Darwinism. The subject challenges us to think about some of the most basic questions involved and what it means to be human and how we relate to our natural and societal worlds. Because of its culturally provocative nature, evolutionary theory is especially likely to test basic, perhaps previously unexamined assumptions. If we can achieve a degree of open-mindedness, then we are encouraged to identify and question our ways of knowing, whether this leads to strengthening our original beliefs, changing them, leaving them as they were, or for the time being at least, placing them in a state of uncertainty or flux. Because of its historical importance and its controversial status in America today, Darwinism as a way of knowing, or as ways of knowing, is especially likely to generate the intellectual and imaginative friction that produces understanding, even if it includes the humility entailed in understanding that there's much that we don't understand. It's an excellent subject for ways of knowing students and instructors to explore, and that's why it's been included in this lecture series and in the course. Our students, by the way, are not required to become Darwinians or Aristotelians or Freudians or Marxists or anything else. We do want them to learn and to think for themselves about what they learn and how they learn. My appreciation for evolutionary matters was deepened in 2004 when I participated in the Honors College's trip to the Galapagos, islands made famous by Darwin's visit there in 1835, because there he saw much that, in retrospect, helped fashion and support his evolutionary theory. The purpose of the Honors College excursion was for participating students to learn about various aspects of the islands, natural and social, cultural and historical, and to shoot footage that later they would edit into documentaries, films that turned out very well. Their planning for the trip, of course, took into account Darwin and his ideas. One of the planners and leaders of the trip was Paul Spruill of the university's Department of Biology, who will be giving the next lecture in this series. And if I get any of my science wrong, maybe he can clear it up for me. The trip involved traveling about the islands by boat with explorations of unique landscapes and their equally unique animals and plants, punctuated by snorkeling expeditions into underwater environments likewise replete with fascinating forms of life. I want to show now several pictures I took on the trip, although a couple of them I got off the internet because my pictures weren't so hot. I have trouble focusing, as you will see, although I think it lends a nice artistic quality to some of them. And I'll show you a few more pictures later on. So at this point, great. So what is this? I'm too close. We got to the Galapagos during its short so-called rainy season, which isn't all that rainy. We had a lot of sunlight. But you can see, at least if you're not colorblind like I am, that I'm told that there's green there along the shore. And oftentimes the vegetation is very brown and more or less blends into the landscape. You can see it's a little misty at this point. And next picture, please. A memorable scene. If any of you saw a movie called Master and Commander a few years ago, this scene figured prominently in it when Russell Crowe and his ship pull up to their first island in the Galapagos. On this island, incidentally, are great flows of lava, apparently quite recent. Nothing's growing on it. So we climbed up to the top of the island and saw the lava flows. And we snorkeled a little bit out there around that rock and in that cove. Next. Yeah, this is the good ship, the yacht Guantanamera. It had a really lively crew. The last group that had been aboard consisted of a lot of old people, and they were really happy to see us, especially the co-eds. And there was dancing every night, and the first night and the second night and the third night, they got out big vats of some kind of local concoction to egg us on and put on the music. I got involved in that, although I am told my dancing resembles that of the blue-footed booby, which I will show you pictures of in due course. Next picture, please. This good-looking fellow greeted us at one of our stops. They're all over the place, but there are variations from island to island, and I thought this was a particularly nice-looking specimen of the marine iguana, who's virtually posing, I think. Yeah. There's also land-based variety. Next. Another one, and I just threw this in because the volcanic rock, the islands are very, very volcanic, very recent in geological terms, which is, as I will show, I think, significant for looking at the flora and fauna of the islands. Next. A giant tortoise. Notice of course you're noticing, the long neck on this. And notice also the notch in the shell. This particular tortoise developed, at least if one believes in evolution, in an environment that encouraged it to reach up to eat off of vegetation. And gradually, in the evolutionary story, developed a shell that would, and a neck that would allow it to get up high and eat cactus. Next. These are evolutions, let's say, of some of the cactus that they like to eat. They're virtually trees, as you can see. And the evolutionary story is as the tortoises' necks got longer and longer, the trees got taller and taller to try to get away from them, and you end up with these interesting, fascinating specimens. Next picture. This is a place we snorkeled. It's the remains of a volcanic cone, and there's a lot of marine life to look at around there. Next. This is a so-called Darwin finch, a bird that's easy to overlook. They're small, and there's nothing particularly pretty about them or outstanding. I had a better picture of one that had hopped up to my foot. They're very tame. And the wildlife on the Galapagos generally is quite tame because of the lack of predators historically. And so there's nothing to be afraid of, so why waste your energy running away from things? But somehow I lost that picture, the one that was by my foot, so I got this off the internet. Next. The islands are very dry, but I was surprised. On some of the larger islands, there are elevations sufficient to produce vegetation. I don't think it rains much, but what happens is that moisture condenses up there and then provides nourishment for vegetation. And that pitch you see, apparently there was a lava chamber or volcanic chamber or something underground, and the whole thing collapsed in and left that. I think that's all for now, and then some more pictures later on to liven us up after I've talked. At the end of the lecture, I'll talk more specifically about what I experienced in the Galapagos. Darwin's 5-week visit occurred during his 5-year circumnavigation of the world, accomplished in his early to his mid-20s, as naturalist aboard the HMS Beagle. He wrote about the voyage, especially about the many land-based visits and journeys he was able to undertake, in a book originally entitled The Journal of Researches, published in 1839 after his return to England, but often appearing today under the title The Voyage of the Beagle, or The Beagle Voyage. The book was popular from the first. The Galapagos chapter, in the original unrevised version especially, suggests that Darwin, at the time of his visit, had not yet arrived at the theory of evolution by natural selection. He still believed that species remained essentially unchanged in the form originally created by God. But his famous theory, set forth 20 years later in The Origin of Species, explains and supports the transformation of species by natural selection. That is, inherent attributes of various groups change over time as physiological and behavioral variations, increasing the likelihood of survival in particular environments, allow those individuals possessing these variations more readily to reproduce and pass their survival-enhancing attributes onto their offspring. Gradually, these changes, because they allow those with them to outcompete those lacking them, will spread throughout a population and, under some circumstances, contribute to the creation of a new species, or a number of new species. Darwin eventually adopted the phrase survival of the fittest, which he borrowed from the English philosopher Herbert Spencer as a kind of shorthand for this process, which is actually quite complex, but it sounds pretty easy if we say evolution by natural selection. As I've indicated, during his visit to the Galapagos, Darwin noted some interesting phenomena that only in retrospect influenced or supported the development of his theory. He saw giant tortoises and was told that they showed local variations in the shapes of their shells according to which islands they came from. This fact became scientifically intelligible once Darwin concluded that a species can evolve along divergent lines in response to different and varied environments, sometimes even changing into new and distinct species through this process. Darwin saw many types of finches. Today, as I said, they're known as Darwin's finches. But only after he returned to England did an anatomist point out that they represented 14 separate but very closely related species whose most notable differences were the shapes and sizes of their beaks. Darwin concluded that they must have evolved from one species originating in South America, which is the nearest landmass to the Galapagos, as that species adapted to different situations and circumstances, what today we call ecological niches, and that the variations in beaks meant that the birds had developed into specialists in securing and eating different types of foods. Interestingly, Darwin's finches, which early on provided evidence for evolution, have over the last 35 years, through the research of Peter and Rosemary Grant, yielded what specialists consider almost or maybe completely definitive proof of Darwin's theory. For many years, the Grants monitored, through innumerable, precise, laboriously compiled measurements, both physical characteristics of the birds and the long-term weather changes in the Galapagos. Through advanced statistical analyses, they substantiated cause and effect relationships between weather patterns, their effects on the habitats, and the physiological changes to the population of finches that they studied year after year on the Galapagos island of Daphne Major. Some of my comments about the Galapagos derive from a book I'll be publishing in June entitled The Evolutionary Imagination in Late Victorian Novels, An Entangled Bank. If it were already published, I'd be out there trying to sell you copies as you leave, but that won't happen. During the latter part of the lecture, I'll draw on language from the epilogue of that book. Its subtitle, An Entangled Bank, refers to Darwin's description of such a scene that occurs at in the final paragraph, at the very beginning of the final paragraph of The Origin of Species. And I'll read that passage to you later. And I'm sure some of you have read it or heard it. It's rather famous. In my book, I point out, although this sort of observation is not at all original with me, that the Galapagos serve as a sort of natural laboratory for evolution because of the relative simplicity of variables there. Although their ecosystems are complicated, the history and physical character of the islands nevertheless let general conditions and patterns of evolutionary change stand out. The relatively young age of the Galapagos, volcanically uplifted from the sea only recently in geological terms, allows their organic history to be more easily deciphered than if they had been more ancient. And the related rocky barrenness of much of the islands makes observations easier. More importantly, their relative proximity to South America and much greater separation from other landmasses, while revealing the origin of some of its species, provided enough isolation to enable a spread of indigenous species that might have been retarded or obscured had various habitats been invaded with any regularity by rival immigrant species. Equally important, the Galapagos, as a group of islands separated by deep channels and strong currents, consist of multiple largely isolated habitats conducive to varied adaptations and the development of new varieties and species, while enabling insight into how historical populations spread out and changed in relation to different environments and ecological niches. In the Galapagos, the workings of evolution have become apparent, even though the precise history of evolutionary change, regarding, for instance, the multiple species of finches, is still very complicated and disorderly. Order and chaos, simplicity and complexity intertwine within a particularly distinctive interweaving of life and death upon these islands made famous by Darwin because they were so important in generating and supporting his theory of evolution by natural selection. The Origin of Species presented this theory in 1859, but Darwin had already worked it out by the early 1840s, not very long after his return to England. There's been much speculation about this almost 20-year so-called publication gap. It has been explained in many ways, but the essential point, I believe, is that he fully realized his ideas would be vigorously, even viciously attacked on both religious and scientific grounds. He knew, for instance, that a book expressing an evolutionary position entitled Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation, published in 1844, had provoked much hostile opposition. Darwin disliked controversy, but more importantly, he wanted to give his theory the greatest chance of swaying his fellow scientists. So year after year, he patiently accumulated masses of evidence, in part through his voluminous correspondence with other scientists around the world, in part through firsthand experiments and observations, and in part through reading any books or papers he thought might either support or refute his ideas. It was only when he learned that another scientist, Alfred Wallace, had come up with the same theory that Darwin's friends pushed him into publication of The Origin. That book provoked attacks, certainly, but he was helped by friends and colleagues who championed his ideas, especially Thomas Huxley, but also the greatest of 19th century geologists, Charles Lyell, who had long opposed evolution until won over by Darwin. Some readers and scientists accepted much or all of Darwin's position, but many rejected it as well, and indeed attacks sometimes were harsh. Whether presented as science or not, opposition was often religiously oriented, but even when it was not overtly such, it was often marked by moral revulsion at some of the perceived implications of Darwinian evolutionary theory. This moral revulsion assumed several interrelated forms. First, and most familiarly, Darwinism was understood to contradict the biblical story of creation. First of all, Darwinian evolution takes a whole lot longer than the creation of the earth does in the telling in Genesis. In Genesis, the biological realm is created in its final form along with the rest of the cosmos within 6 days, whereas Darwin, building upon 19th century geology, assumes continual biological changes occurring over great expanses of time. For biblical literalists and fundamentalists generally, this, of course, is still a major problem with evolution. For many, both past and present, another distasteful attribute of evolutionary theory is that it appears to displace our species from the center of creation, subverting the dignity and exalted status of humans confirmed by the Genesis idea that God afforded them special attention and care and even created them in his own image. Particularly obnoxious for many is the notion that we are closely related to supposedly lower life forms, including monkeys and apes, our obvious similarities to which perhaps making the connection all the more important to deny. Like that of a particularly embarrassing cousin, say. Some modern theorists have recently compounded the affront by contending that humans can justifiably be called a fifth ape, along with orangutans, gorillas, and the 2 species of chimpanzees, or perhaps a third chimpanzee, along with standard chimps and bonobos, also known as pygmy chimps. One often reads that chimps and humans possess 98 or 99% of their DNA in common, thus indicating a recent common ancestor, recent by geological standards anyway, living only 5 million years ago. This sort of thinking for some involves an invidious mixing up of categories they want to keep separate. Darwin championed the close relationship between humans and their animal relatives, which in his view dignified animals rather than demeaned humans. The main title of my lecture is Darwin and Other Apes, and I think that I thought that might sound better than Other Apes and Us, while capturing the notion that in this country many consider Darwin a lower sort of being, even a diabolical one. And I've heard people say that kind of thing. A strange fate for a man who, by all accounts, was honorable, modest, and kind, as well as courageous in pursuing scientific truth through many years of bad health. Another problem with evolution was, and is, that it often seems to describe a chaotic rather than an orderly universe. The overlapping of categories is one aspect of this conceptual disorder. A related problem is that Darwinian theory is based on the idea of variability, that individuals naturally differ from one another, and that some of these variations, a small minority, offer survival value, in other words, an advantage in survival and reproduction. For example, a finch with a bigger, stouter beak than its brethren would have an advantage in cracking certain types of seeds and therefore live longer and be likely to produce more offspring, which would be likely to have the same advantageous trait, perhaps in an even more enhanced form. Wanting to believe that nature is ultimately an orderly place, Darwin thought there must be some laws that determine how and when variations occur, but even in his own day, individual variations appeared to occur randomly, a conclusion confirmed by modern genetics, which takes into account mutations, which Darwin didn't know about. Furthermore, the environmental conditions that help determine which variations provide survival advantages for particular traits also seem, if not entirely random, at least too multitudinous and complex to fully understand. Thus, the world seems governed by chance, a repugnant idea for a species that likes to have a clear picture of things. Another dimension of Darwinism that might appear disorderly is that overall evolution is not headed anywhere in particular. It is not teleological or directed towards a goal. It just happens, driven along by self-directing forces that make future evolutionary developments largely unpredictable because of contingency and the complexity of all the forces and factors that act upon it. A further aspect of Darwinian evolution, often viewed negatively, is that it emphasizes struggle, suffering, death, and extinction. Such traits not only imply moral confusion, but they make it more difficult to believe this world is created or sanctioned by a benevolent deity. Even before the origin, some Victorians, looking at the findings of geology and at earlier evolutionary ideas, were intimidated by such a world. Lord Tennyson famously incorporated this sort of worry into his great poem In Memoriam, AHH, published 9 years prior to the origin, and recording his depression and loss of faith, temporary loss of faith, catalyzed by the death of his beloved friend Arthur Henry Hallam. The relevant lines in the emotional low point of this elegy that expresses both religious doubt and the eventual recovery of a qualified faith concern scientific findings that make nature appear violent, cruel, and wasteful. The depressed speaker considers that individuals living their brief, insecure lives are of small worth in the overall scheme of things, but then he considers the testimony of fossils found, as he says, quote, in scarped cliff and quarried stone, unquote, fossils that proclaim that even types, in other words, species, that even species also soon die out, become extinct. The demoralizing idea here is that nature, which Tennyson famously identifies as red in tooth and claw, with ravin, with rapaciousness, cares for nothing, and that humans themselves, despite their seemingly great accomplishments, despite their temples and prayers, are destined for extinction. I'm going to be less gloomy later on. I want you to know this. Tennyson, and this is a low point for Tennyson in his poem. And then he regains his faith and overcomes his sadness at the loss of his beloved friend. Tennyson uses a somewhat obscure word, fanes, for temples or churches. Are God and nature then at strife that nature lends such evil dreams? So careful of the type she seems, so careless of the single life, that I, considering everywhere her secret meaning in her deeds, and finding that of 50 seeds she often brings but one to bear, I falter where I firmly trod. And then Tennyson adjusts his thought, becoming even gloomier. So careful of the type, but no, From scarped cliff and quarried stone she cries. Now the she here is nature, so this is in quotation. This is what nature cries. 1,000 types are gone, I care for nothing, all shall go. Thou makest thine appeal to me? I bring to life, I bring to death. The spirit does but mean the breath. I know no more. End of quote from nature. And shall he, man, her last work, who seemed so fair, such splendid purpose in his eyes, who rolled the psalm to wintry skies, who built him fanes of fruitless prayer, who trusted God was love indeed, and love creation's final law, though nature red in tooth and claw with ravin shrieked against his creed, who loved, who suffered countless ills, who battled for the true, the just, be blown about the desert dust, or sealed within the iron hills. In other words, are humans destined to become a mere fossil remain of one more extinct species? It's been estimated that 99% of all species that have ever lived are now extinct. In such a view, nature appears not only chaotic, but mindlessly cruel, immoral, or amoral at best. Darwin occasionally felt this way himself. In a letter to his friend and colleague, the botanist Joseph Hooker, he exclaims, quote, "What a book a devil's chaplain might write on the clumsy, wasteful, blundering, low, and horribly cruel works of nature." He had those moments. Soon after the publication of The Origin, Darwin wrote to another colleague that he had trouble seeing evidence of God's existence, for, quote, "There seems to me too much misery in the world. I cannot persuade myself that a beneficent and omnipotent God would have designedly created the ichneumonidae with the express intention of their feeding within the living bodies of caterpillars. The ichneumon fly is a wasp that injects its eggs into the bodies of live caterpillars, and after hatching, the larval wasps eat their host from the inside out. This kind of behavior suggests that the only rule in evolution is whatever works. Whatever allows individuals to live and reproduce, no matter how morally disquieting we may find nature's survival and reproductive tactics. Another quality of Darwinism that some have found unpleasant is the phenomenon of degeneration, in which species assume forms or functions resembling those characterizing earlier, more rudimentary evolutionary stages. Darwin acknowledges but gives relatively little attention to this phenomenon in The Origin itself, although he does discuss a form of barnacle called the proteolepis, which by evolving into a parasite living within a host species, devolved in various ways, for instance, losing most of its head, which was little needed for its new lifestyle. I mean, a number of us find those lifestyles, right? And when we talk metaphorically about someone losing his or her head, we might remember the proteolepis and think of becoming emotionally unhinged as psychological degeneration to a childish or earlier stage of life. But some animals are actually more highly developed in early stages of life than in later ones. And since we're in an academic setting, more or less, here's a description by philosopher Daniel Dennett of the life cycle of the marine animal called a sea squirt that characterizes this form of degeneration. Quote, "The juvenile sea squirt wanders through the sea searching for a suitable rock or hunk of coral to cling to and make its home for life. For this task, it has a rudimentary nervous system. When it finds its spot and takes root, it doesn't need its brain anymore, so it eats it. It's rather like getting tenure." That was Daniel Dennett's joke, not mine, but I wish it were mine. I should have claimed it. Some of us in the ways of knowing, of course, do have tenure, but I like to think none of us has become intellectually inert and eaten our brain. After I'm through with my lecture, you can decide whether that's happened to me. I mentioned barnacles. Darwin was the world expert on barnacles, having intensely studied them for years prior to writing The Origin of Species and having published the definitive work on these humble marine creatures. He felt that they taught him much about close observation and the small-scale workings of evolution. In a novel by a popular Victorian author, Darwin appears in the guise of Professor Long, who spent many, many years studying limpets, a tiny mollusk, and publishing, we're told, 2 huge volumes on the subject. This treatment reflects that Darwin was a well-known scientist prior to publishing The Origin of Species, his notoriety beginning with his Beagle Journal and various scientific papers that grew out of his voyage. Late Victorians, including Victorian novelists, picked up on various aspects of evolutionary theory and often because of social worries that undermined the confidence of late Victorian society, they responded to what seemed the more negative implications of Darwinism. For example, in Dracula, published by Bram Stoker in 1897, the title character reproduces his characteristics in an unsavory, vampiric fashion, involving forms of struggle, predation, parasitism, and death, tactics suggestive of natural selection, and he carries overtones of lower forms of life, including enlarged canines, pointed ears, hair on the palms of his hands, and long, sharp nails. He also takes on qualities of bats, lizards, and parasites. Returned to his coffin after a feeding, he is described this way. It seemed as if the whole awful creature were simply gorged with blood. He lay like a filthy leech, exhausted with his repletion. It's good stuff, huh? When he turns into a cloud of particles to flow around and through obstacles, he is so elemental that he seems to have devolved out of the organic realm entirely. Yet in some ways, Dracula is superhuman. Confusedly, he is at once an evolutionary triumph and a degenerative moral nightmare. And in this combination, he reflects something of the confusion created by Darwinism as it was absorbed by general Victorian culture. The Time Machine, published in 1895, and sometimes considered the first true science fiction novel, in it, H.G. Wells also draws on less attractive applications of evolutionary theory. Wells had studied biology under Darwin's famous disciple Thomas Huxley and written a textbook that includes a very accurate account of Darwin's theory. In his novel, he applies his evolutionary knowledge in an amazing fashion. One of his innovations there is to imagine evolution responding to artificial rather than natural environments. Suppose human society endures long enough for humans to undergo radical evolutionary changes in response to their own social surroundings. Actually, in recent years, evolutionary psychologists have been proposing evidence for this. Evolution consists of hereditarily expressed changes over time to characteristics within populations, and as we've seen, these changes do not take into account our moral sensibilities. Wells imagines a world of the distant future in which, because human society had once become divided into slaves laboring underground and masters leading pampered lives above ground, the human race gradually became transformed into two entirely separate species, each physically, mentally, and morally degenerated in its own way. The terrestrial species has become infantile and helpless and, it turns out, are kept alive only through their breeding and feeding by the bestial subterranean species that uses them for livestock. It's a horrifying and intriguing setup. The novel describes an even more distant future in which life dies out altogether as the earth loses its heat and even the sun itself decays. Wells uses this gloomy picture of the future to tell us that we have no special status in the universe and that we'd better understand our own animal nature, including our propensity for aggression and for territoriality, and based upon this knowledge, create our own values and educate our children in such a way to make our continued existence as likely as possible, even though nothing is assured in such a universe. Darwinian evolution tells a multi-sided story about humanity and its world, and some late Victorians elaborated on Darwin's theory in ways that seem positive to them, although not necessarily so to us. While the origin might seem to feature randomness, competition, struggle, death, extinction, and the insignificance of humanity, it could be interpreted to endorse the importance of our species. Some people who had directly or indirectly imbibed Darwinian ideas read them as affirming humanity as an evolutionary triumph, no matter how problematic the process by which we evolved. These interpreters understood evolution to imply progress, and this progress had produced us at the top of the evolutionary tree, its most recent and its finest fruit. The danger here, of course, is arrogance and a dismissive attitude towards those supposedly lower down. Unattractive to most of us today is the way in which the progressivist interpretation of evolution sometimes supported racist ideas, since it allowed the placement of non-white, seemingly less progressive races further down on the evolutionary tree, where they occupied positions of inferiority marked by overtones of slow or arrested evolutionary development. Furthermore, the struggle and competition of natural selection that many found objectionable, to others supported the idea that struggle and competition are sanctioned by the natural scheme of things, and therefore ought to apply not only to nature but to society, therefore endorsing the subjection of the poor and the powerless by the rich and the powerful, of losers by winners. In the form of so-called social Darwinism, this thinking justified domination and exploitation of lower classes or of less powerful peoples. In some cases, it justified extermination of indigenous peoples or, in the case of the Nazis, of Jews and other despised groups. A related application or misapplication of Darwinism also underwrote the late 19th and early 20th century eugenic movement. And here again we think of Nazis. which championed the notion that only the fittest humans should be allowed to breed or maybe even to live, as if any individual or group is wise enough to be entrusted with the power of determining what constitutes fitness or who is or is not worthy of life. Despite seeming positive to some, these foregoing ideas, largely derived from dark views of nature, look unattractive to us just as they did to many in Darwin's time. They are not ideas Darwin generally endorsed, and some of them he actively opposed, although they had their roots in the tensions within the origin itself. But that work also allows a more attractive interpretation of evolution, one that identifies wonder and beauty in nature's dispensations, and Darwin was often overt in presenting this side of the case. A strange two-sidedness informs the origin, in which nature looks dark, but also appears beautiful and supportive of what is best in us. It's akin to the quality Ron Perrin identified in his talk last week about Greek mythology, where nature can be kind or can taunt and mock us. Darwin's renderings of kindly nature in the origin draw on the romantic reverence for nature, and Darwin read the Romantic poets as a young man, a reverence in which the imagination finds wonderment in the interaction of the human mind with the non-cultural world. I came across a Calvin and Hobbes cartoon that captures this two-sidedness of nature, moving from the awesome to the awful. If you remember Calvin and Hobbes, you remember Calvin's this little kid with an IQ of about 200 that he uses for diabolical purposes by and large. In the first panel, what you'll see is Calvin extolling the beauties of nature in language that makes it clear he's read Lord Tennyson or the 19th century poets. So he's a remarkable little boy. In the second one, he's just a little boy. Can we have that next picture? It's both sides are there. You know, where do you want to look? Although some people maybe can find beauty in that as well. It's spiders, for instance. I subtitled this lecture Climbing the Tree of Life, but by now it should be evident that whether we consider some life forms, especially our own, as inherently higher or better than others depends upon what standards of assessment we apply. Naturally, humans tend to apply standards that privilege what seem their most positive attributes. A proteolepis, or a sea squirt, were it able to think with little or no head, might conclude that headlessness is a sign of advanced evolution. In producing us, have our evolutionary ancestors been climbing, moving upward, becoming somehow fundamentally better? Or, as many Darwinians believe, does evolution simply mean change brought on by adaptations to particular circumstances, that increased complexity does not mean improvement in any absolute sense? Some animals get by better when they lose their heads or devolve. In The Origin of Species, Darwin sees nature as both ugly and beautiful, and he seems divided also about whether the status of so-called higher animals reflects some ultimate form of progress. In The Origin, he had steered away from discussion of human evolution, figuring it would only get him into more trouble than he already anticipated. By 1871, however, he felt comfortable enough to publish a book entitled The Descent of Man. The full title is The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex. It's a two-part book. The Descent of Man, which explains how humans also evolved via natural selection, and it offers much evidence for our evolutionary kinship with other animals. Nevertheless, in this book, he contends that humans indeed have morally ascended, that in this sense we have indeed climbed the tree of life, although in the title he uses the metaphor of descent because it conveys the readily understandable idea of family relationships based upon genealogy. The Descent of Man contends that sympathy and its offshoot morality grew out of the social instincts of our pre-human ancestors and continue to develop because of the survival value for individuals when they cooperate with others. Darwin believes these factors gradually defeat inter-group hostilities through an expanding sense of mutual identity that eventually will encompass and recognize interconnections between all forms of life. Without mentioning humans, The Origin had already emphasized interconnectedness within the biosphere. Darwin stressed how amazingly entangled life is with other forms of life and with environments. He gives what he recognizes as a very simple example of this interrelatedness when he explains why the amount of red clover in parts of England depends upon the number of cats that live there. Anybody got it? He explains that bees pollinate clover, mice eat the honeycombs of bees, but cats eat mice. More cats, more clover. Darwin gives more elaborate examples, but he explains that life is so involved with the rest of life that it is impossible to disentangle or even recognize all of the connections. With today's ecological consciousness, which Dan Spencer will talk about in 2 weeks to us, we understand something Darwin also recognized, that altering one part of nature can have far-reaching and unpredictable consequences. Because he anticipated the difficulties readers were likely to have with his ideas, The Origin of Species uses not only many examples, but it employs verbal images and metaphors to address readers' imaginations when Darwin is uncertain that appeals to reason will suffice for explicating complex ideas or ones that might be too new or too unfamiliar to be easily comprehensible. One of his metaphors is the great tree of life. Early in his career, in one of his so-called transmutation notebooks, he first sketched a version of this tree that, in its early form, more closely resembles a drooping shrub. Can we have that picture? Okay. In The Origin, this is how the picture has evolved. Next picture. It's not very helpful. In Chapter 4, he elucidates this diagram, which depicts the fate of 11 species of just one genus as it elaborates itself upward through time. He spends 10 pages explaining certain dynamic qualities and relationships of varieties, species, and genre that the diagram depicts. But he acknowledges that his diagram, by schematizing some details, he falsifies others, and the connection of this regularized image to a tree is incidental. A visual picture could never adequately reconstruct the unpredictable snarls, twists, and turns, and the amazing complexity of evolutionary history. But at the end of the chapter, Darwin offers a simple verbal description of the great tree of life, and here it is much more organic seeming and much more compelling because he now allows the reader's imaginations to do the work. The main idea of this extended metaphor is that life branches and branches again, as species sometimes radiate into multiple species, with limbs increasingly diverging, as upward growth turns small changes into larger ones, twigs into branches, and varieties into distinct species, enveloping the world over millions of years. Some branches, he says, die and fall off. These represent extinct species, or whole groups of species. He verbally sketches the tree of life over several pages and concludes this way, quote, "As buds give rise by growth to fresh buds, and these, if vigorous, branch out and overtop on all sides many a feebler branch, so by generation I believe it has been with the great tree of life, which fills with its dead and broken branches the crust of the earth and covers the surface with its ever-branching and beautiful ramifications." Notice, despite the dead branches, this appeal to beauty. It is typical. At many points in The Origin and his other writings, he characterizes the endlessly creative adaptations and interrelationships of organic nature as both beautiful and awe-inspiring, and such is the case with the great tree of life, as it grows and changes through time and space, enveloping the world with its evolutions. The powerful language of the final paragraph of The Origin of Species, beginning with its rendering of an entangled bank, again evokes these qualities of beauty and awesomeness. It is interesting to contemplate an entangled bank, clothed with many plants of many kinds, with birds singing in the bushes, with various insects flitting about, and with worms crawling through the damp earth, and to reflect that these elaborately constructed forms, so different from each other and dependent upon each other in so complex a manner, have all been produced by laws acting around us. These laws, taken in the largest sense, being growth with reproduction, inheritance, which is almost implied by reproduction, variability from the indirect and direct action of external conditions of life and from use and disuse, a ratio of increase so high as to lead to a struggle for life, and as a consequence to natural selection entailing divergence of character and the extinction of less improved forms. Thus, from the war of nature, from famine and death, the most exalted object which we are capable of conceiving, namely the production of the higher animals, directly follows. There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that, whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful have been and are being evolved. There are many points that could be made about this rhetorical crescendo of Darwin's famous and revolutionary book. For example, the desire to persuade draws his passage into orthodox religion. Life has been breathed into one or more original forms of life, which echoes Genesis 2. Here, Darwin also, through reference to the higher animals, touches on the idea that evolution involves progress and perhaps teleology as well. For we, of course, generally consider ourselves the highest form of the highest animals, the species towards which God directed his life-bestowing breath. But Darwin, in fact, was just impressed by supposedly lower, as by so-called higher animals. And he had a particular fondness for those worms he describes as crawling through the damp earth. One of his early papers explained how earthworms, by breaking up and replenishing soil, make possible the growth of vegetation and all the animals that directly or indirectly live off of it. And his final book, published 50 years later in 1881, shortly before his death, also was about the significance of worms. He loved tiny things, including the generally small, barely perceptible workings of nature that in the long run produce enormous consequences. I've read the conclusion of The Origin to give a sense that despite all the ugliness or indifference that nature exhibits, and in the face of all the problematic applications to which his ideas are susceptible, Darwin celebrates on scales both great and small, nature is wonderful, and ourselves, with our potential for moral development and our capacity for cherishing this amazing planet we inhabit, as wonderfully a part of it all. The word religion is generally thought to derive from the Latin word for tie or bind. Evolution ties the world together, both in time and space, in an incredible fashion. It can encourage us both to wonder at and reverence this great story and our role in it. In some ways, it's like religion, even if, like religion, it causes us to struggle with the problem of evil. I was thinking, in response to Gary Hawk's talk 2 weeks ago, about the book of Job and the problem of suffering, that although God makes Job, the individual, seem small in the face of the vast universe that God evokes through the magnificent poetry of his questionings, he nevertheless does answer Job. God speaks to him directly, gives him individual attention. I think somebody asked a question at the end of Gary's lecture that touched upon this. So Job is forced to surrender his egocentrism, but the message isn't that he's nothing. Rather, I think, it is that he is consequential because he is not an alien or outcast, but rather part of this vast creation and therefore worthy of hearing God's voice, as, at least in this metaphorical sense, are we all. Seeing our world in this way surely must help assuage the suffering we all inevitably must face. There's been quite a cultural clash in recent years about whether science and religion can coexist. It depends on how one defines science and religion, and in my understanding, as I've implied, the two aren't necessarily antagonistic. But I do think that those who accept their incompatibility and focus on Darwinism as exhibit A for the insufficiency of science have to work hard if they are actually to understand and then reject evidence that has been piling up at an increasing rate for the last century and a half. I've mentioned the Grant's research into the evolution of Darwin's finches. Another well-publicized and readily comprehensible piece of evidence concerns the increased immunity of germs to antibiotics. Bacteria naturally resistant to antibiotics readily propagate while those without that advantage die out, so that gradually the resistant strains take over. That Darwinian evolution, that's Darwinian evolution. A population has hereditarily changed through natural selection. This immunity of various strains of bacteria to antibiotics reflects Darwinian evolution. A population has hereditarily changed through natural selection. Genetics and the recent sequencing of the human genome are yielding new evolutionary evidence and explications as well. For example, DNA analysis has produced evolutionary insight into the phenomenon of lactose intolerance. Adult mammals lose the ability to digest milk, specifically the sugar lactose, because in nature only the young drink milk. But through the study of genetic mutation, scientists have determined when certain human populations develop the ability as adults to manufacture lactase, the enzyme that breaks down lactose, and it turns out this transformation coincides with the time they began domesticating livestock. Today's descendants of these groups are those most likely to be able to drink milk without trouble. One can imagine the survival advantages of this capability for ancient herders. It provided a steady source of protein and sugar in a world constantly threatened by famine, or of water in areas susceptible to drought, allowing individuals with a mutation for milk digestion on average to live longer and produce more offspring, passing on their adaptive trait to future generations. And it appears that selection pressure in such a situation causes evolution to occur much more quickly than once was thought. Another interesting implication of lactose tolerance is that evolution reacts not only to natural environments, but to cultural ones as well, or to cultural changes, as H.G. Wells more or less foresaw. The evolutionary interaction between nature and culture is a focus of the rapidly developing field that often goes by the name of evolutionary psychology, which describes how human behavioral and cultural traits arise through natural selection. Now I'm going to return us to the Galapagos, which to a greater or lesser degree all visitors view through a Darwinian lens. I've read that Christian fundamentalist groups have organized tours of the island to explain how Darwin misinterpreted what he saw there. Nevertheless, despite such efforts, his ideas will remain, I believe, front and center, controlling discussions and controversies. There's simply too much evidence to be embraced or denied, as the case may be. Like others who visit the Galapagos, the students and professors on the honors college trip saw many of the same species Darwin observed, but necessarily viewed them in terms of their evolutionary history. Augmented by primordial landforms, the dimension of time permeates one's consciousness in the Galapagos because of Darwin's visit there and the island's subsequent role in the development of his theory, a theory that caused to be reinterpreted both the length and history of the Earth and of life on Earth and the meaning of his own visit, thereby turning the archipelago into today's mecca for ecotourism. The uniqueness of many of its species, their connection to Darwin, and their genealogical interrelationships have made them worthy of observation and of the protection enabled especially by tourist revenue. The islands are protected as an Ecuadorian national park, a World Heritage Site, and a rich arena for research conducted by the Charles Darwin Research Foundation and other scientific groups. The interest of scientists, the reverence of visitors, and the resulting care of the Galapagos wildlife once again justify the tameness of much of its fauna, which, because it evolved apart from terrestrial predators, was not shaped by natural selection for shyness or evasion of humans. While still dry and often barren-looking, the Galapagos no longer seem horrid or infernal as they did to many early visitors. History has changed our understanding of them because of the incredible life they foster and so readily offer to our view. This history makes them fertile with a significance that contributes to the romance of their stark beauty and their sense of mystery. Unlike Darwin, we visited the islands when the brief rainy season was just beginning to transform the leafless, dead-looking vegetation along the shore into a ribbon of green. Life rather than death and clarity rather than entanglement seemed to be turning the islands into a place more appropriate to the richness of its evolutionary significance. It is, of course, the remarkable energy and creativity of life, not of death, that amazes visitors. For one thing, novel adaptations testify to the formative power of evolution, while generally disguising the mortality that is also necessary for the process, as Darwin so powerfully and sometimes painfully recognized. Some of these adaptations concern indigenous species that have become amphibious. The marine iguana, having split off from its terrestrial cousin, developed into the world's only ocean-going lizard. Its sinuous tail moves it through the water as it feeds on seaweed, and after emerging from the sea, it can be observed ridding itself, through glands in its head, of excess salt it has taken in. Evolution has changed the flightless cormorant in an even more overt manner. I was disappointed not to actually see a flightless cormorant. But not needing wings for its marine excursions for fish, they have atrophied, selected against, so the bird's bodily resources will not be wasted on features bearing little or no survival value. And the giant tortoises have evolved various mechanisms that allow them to go without water for extremely long periods. In the Galapagos, one also sees non-indigenous species, sea lions, fur seals, and penguins in particular, that prior to their arrival on the islands already have become adapted to the ocean. Cut off relatively recently from their native climes by shifting weather and current patterns, the fur seals and penguins as yet are only imperfectly fitted to the warmth of the islands and therefore generally avoid the sun. They are, in fact, most likely engaged in a struggle against extinction. If the indigenous giant tortoise and iguana are the iconic animals of the islands, the celebrity of the blue-footed booby, it lives on other dry, isolated Pacific islands but inhabits the Galapagos in far greater numbers, does not lag far behind. Let's have several pictures now. This actually is a masked booby, but I like the way he was showing us the direction in case we missed this sign.
Does he dance?
No, but the blue-footed booby is the dance. You'll see that. In fact, let's have another picture. Yeah, good-looking fellow, isn't he? Look at those feet. The chick's really digging. Next picture. Ah, okay. So there he is, being irresistible, he hopes. The behavior of this large bird, which also has developed no fear of humans, is arresting and on land comical because of its ungainly movements. In its mating behavior, enacting the dynamics of sexual selection that Darwin was the first to understand, the male struts about, lifting its large blue feet high up in front of him for better display, and then, if well received by a female, joins her in raising their long tapered beaks to the sky and emitting mating whistles. I did not witness this routine firsthand. The timing of our visit perhaps wasn't quite right for that. But I did see another distinctive aspect of ritualized sexual behavior. The male blue-footed booby selects, according to some unknown standards of discrimination, certain twigs that it offers to the female, depositing them about her. This behavior is thought to be vestigial, a holdover from when ancestral boobies built nests. Today's blue-footed boobies developed without predators, and therefore the female lays her eggs seemingly almost at random on open ground with only a scraggly ring of guano to mark the perimeter. On trails, you sometimes have to step around their nests as the birds look on unconcerned. Although the terrestrial doings of the blue-footed boobies seem clownish, on the wing they are swift and graceful, diving from high in the air, wings folded tight against their sides to catch fish with great precision. Let's have a next picture. I don't know if he's beginning his dive or what, but it's an entirely different deal when they're in the air or on the water. Sometimes they fish in flocks, seemingly coordinating with one another their dives in relation to the locations of schools of fish. Scientists have recognized several evolutionary developed adaptations for diving. An air chamber in the head cushions it from the blow it receives upon hitting the water. Its nostrils close to keep out water, and its tail, constructed as a sort of rudder, allows it to plunge from great heights into shallow water, giving it an advantage over other species of fish-hunting birds. It sometimes chases fish underwater. I spent quite a while watching the amazing display of speed and deftness as a flock of blue-footed boobies fished along the shoreline. All this activity is attractive, but such is not the case for another, less celebrated behavior. Blue-footed boobies generally hatch 2 or 3 eggs, and sometimes an older sibling, to secure more food from parents when fish are in short supply, will push a younger bird away from the nest area, causing it to die of starvation and exposure. This behavior is known as obligate siblicide or sibling murder. Notice the moral terminology there. And it occurs also in the mass booby, but in a more extreme form. In this species, an older sibling violently displaces a younger one, regardless of the availability of food. The only purpose of the younger bird seems to be as backup should the older bird for some reason die before it can assert its dominance. I saw the dried up remains of young boobies, possibly the losers in such exercises of survival of the fittest. Like the common plants that lose leaves and go dormant through much of the year to protect against water loss, the animal life of the islands has made, without concern for human aesthetic or ethical standards, evolutionary adjustments that are often just as evident. Everywhere in the Galapagos, one sees forms of life, plants and animals alike, bearing the stamp of evolutionary history that Darwin taught us to perceive, a history that makes death as much the source of creativity and change as life. The two are as inseparable as the randomness of individual variation and such determinisms as exist in heredity and the environment. The islands constitute a text intermixing life and death, past and present, organism and environment, order and chaos, external reality and the human mind. One interprets this untidy document through Darwinism, but more specifically, like late Victorian novels, immersed in the implications and the applications of evolutionary theory through the needs, longings, and fears of our own venturing species. While ecotourism hardly compares with the adventures of Darwin's 5-year Beagle voyage, visiting the Galapagos reminded me of the unpredictable and implausible adventure in which we all participate, the adventure our species has undergone evolving from and along with its animal relatives. Recognizing connections all about, disclosing prospects of wonderment, the evolutionary imagination, although it can focus insecurities about human insignificance and mortality, also has the potential of making us more at home on and more thankful for this extraordinary fathomless planet. Yeah.
Okay, are there any questions?
Can you tell us if other religions in the world have trouble with Darwinian evolution, or is that something that is mostly bothering some Christians?
I'm willing to stand corrected on this, but my understanding is that only fundamentalist Christianity has a major problem. I think in Islam there's some trouble, certainly not in Buddhism or Hinduism, Far Eastern religions. I think any religion that has a sacred book, and some people that are going to read it, literally, there are going to be problems because it's going to contradict, I think, many things that science teaches. So I think that comes with the territory, maybe. Yes. Oh.
Tell me if you can't hear me. Maybe you can hear me. I just was wondering if you had any conjecture about why the conflict with fundamentalist Christianity was such a big deal in this country. Was it just because of Scope's trial, or was there something else, some other social event?
That's, historically, and some of you know more about this than I mean, there were these problems in England and Europe in the 19th century. They seem to go away, by and large. This country, because of all kinds of historical factors, has held on to its fundamentalist religion much more strongly. I mean, part of that might go all the way back to the fact that this country was founded in many cases by dissenters, and we certainly inherit that legacy. There are all kinds of other historical factors, though, that seem to play into the fact that this is an issue here far more than anywhere else. Yes. Oh, yes. And then yes.
Yes, first here. During Darwin's time, I believe it was in England that they were first coming up with the dinosaur remnants, and I don't recall if Darwin used any of that material in his writings.
He doesn't use much of the dinosaur stuff. He in his writings, he refers to it. Those fossils were turning up with increased regularity in the late 18th century and the 19th century, especially through the expanded operations in quarrying. And then that generated a lot of interest, and people became fossil hunters and collectors and so forth. Darwin was aware of that and mentioned it. He made maybe more use of some of the fossils that he found in South America on his journey on the Pampas and Tierra del Fuego and other places in southern South America. He had this extensive network of communication with other scientists around the world, so he was informed of everything that happened.
You'd mentioned that there's no question Darwin believed that there could be enough changing within a species to literally change the species, to come to a new creation, a new species. And I guess what I would ask is, haven't we still to explain the missing link between, the ape and man?
Well, my sense is, if you follow the literature, there are more and more finds being made filling in that gap. It hardly seems like a gap anymore. Darwin himself explained that fossils happen, are produced very, very rarely. Conditions have to be very, very special, very unusual for fossils to occur anyway. It's somewhat amazing, all the fossils that are turning up. But it seems like there are more and more fossils that fill in between what we think of as human characteristics and those of an ape-like ancestor, and fossils of these creatures have been found as well. For instance, for a long time it was assumed that until fairly recently, those who believed in evolution believed until fairly recently our ancestors were all leaning over like gorillas, because that was our model, or like chimps. And now it turns out in the fossils that have been found that upright stature has been going on for millions of years. It was only later that the cranium developed. So they were separate episodes somehow. And so there are more and more finds like that are filling in the gap, I think. The missing link was a big deal in the 19th century. Everybody was looking for the missing link. Every once in a while somebody would concoct something in his back room and say, yeah, look, it's a missing link. The Piltdown man in the early 20th century, somebody got what was it, a human skull and a jawbone of a orangutan or something, put them together, and this was found in England, and this is a very patriotic thing. Oh, look, we have the oldest guy right here in England. And sometimes anti-evolutionists use that as an example of how science gets messed up, and you can't trust it. But the relevant point there is the scientists are the ones, when they finally got a good look at this thing, that said it's not what it is, it's a hoax. So science is a self-correcting project. You know, it doesn't get everything right, but there seems to be a kind of progress in understanding.
How about over there, and then you take it.
It seems to me when I was a college student a long, long time ago, Darwinism was pretty much accepted. I can't even imagine walking into a class in the 60s, a science class, even questioning it. Do you find your students, you teach this in the Ways of Knowing class, do you find that students who are in college pretty much accept Darwinism, or do you find many of them truly struggling with this issue?
The latter, I think. I think some are struggling with the issue. Last semester I had a student who came to me early on. She said, I want you to know, no matter what goes on in here, and I'll read about Darwin and try to learn about Darwinism, but I'm not going to believe in evolution. And I said, okay, you know, if you're going to reject something, at least it's good to understand as much as you can about what it is you're rejecting. So my sense is sometimes students who don't believe in evolution might be hesitant to reveal that, and sometimes that's not the case. But I think there's a good-sized minority, even in college, of students who don't accept evolution, and I think we need to be sensitive to that, you know. And I don't see, obviously, as you've heard, I think Darwin got it pretty well correct, but I don't want to beat anyone over the head with that. I just want them to think about it, you know. And then down in front.
Well, it makes the most sense of anything I have ever read. That's why I believe in it.
Okay, I don't know if you heard that. She says it makes as much sense as anything she's ever read. As the most sense of anything she's ever read. So that's why she believes in it.
John, I was wondering, one of the things that I find absolutely fascinating is over these centuries, the century preceding Darwin and then the Darwin century, was how human concepts of time changed radically. So a century or two before, the standard view was the Earth was 6,000 years old, or maybe a few thousand years older than that. And then I understand at least part of Darwin's struggle was being able to actually have enough time for these changes to take place that his theory would develop, and
Right.
Lord Kelvin's estimates of time not giving enough. Could you talk a little bit about what was going on with human concepts of time and why that was so important for Darwin's theory?
Yeah, sure. Well, generally, up through most of the 18th century, as you know, the tendency was to believe the world was 6,000 years old or something like that. Bishop Ussher in Ireland had gone through the Bible and looked at genealogies and who begat whom and so forth and so on, and was able to precisely tell when the earth was created. And do you have the date, Dan? It's slipping my mind. Paul? 4004 BC. And then, yeah. Yeah, right. He knew the exact time of day. And I don't know if everybody bought into that, but they thought, yeah, that's more length. So what a stretch of the imagination to come up with this incredible concept of time that's so beyond the limits of what we experience. You know, we live a few years and we're gone, and now people are talking about hundreds of thousands, and millions, and billions of years. Humans can't conceive of this stuff very well at all. It only very gradually, I think, influenced the reading public. There's a real lag time. The geologists, of course, started this by figuring out, you know, how long it would take things to fossilize, or, you know, people found fossils on top of mountains, marine fossils. Well, how long would it take a mountain, you know, for the fossil to die, become fossilized, and then geological changes to raise that part of the Earth to 9 or 10 or 20,000 feet or whatever? Darwin saw fossils like this in the Andes. At a known rate of erosion, how long would it take for a river to carve a great canyon, that kind of stuff? Figuring out various strata of the geological record and how long it would take to lay those down or to buckle some of these in certain ways. So the geologists, Charles Lyell was in the vanguard of this, were absolutely important, vital for Darwin's theory. So he knew the geology. He was a good friend with Lyell himself. He felt that evolution would take a long, long time, probably longer than it actually takes sometimes today. Because under certain situations where a particular adaptation is really going to make the difference between life and death, under certain circumstances, evolution can move rather quickly, even in, well, with bacteria, within a few years, but for humans even within some thousands of years. Darwin was always bothered by that. Lord Kelvin, not knowing anything about nuclear energy, based upon the rate at which the sun was dispersing its energy, figured that the universe wasn't, the solar system wasn't nearly as old as Darwin had hoped that it was. And this really worried Darwin. And what he started doing was tweaking his theory a little bit to allow for secondary causes besides natural selection. And you even get a little bit of this in the origin. So you can see his nervousness at this kind of thought. But I don't think it was well into the 19th century before most people could even sort of begin to get their minds around the idea of the incredible age of the Earth. And some people still can't.
May I ask a question?
No.
John, do you know, no. Do you know, we were talking before about the movie that I saw where the Confederate general was saying that nobody would consider that Robert E. Lee was descended from an ape.
Yeah. Maybe you or me, but not Robert
Yeah,
E. Lee,
that's right. Do you know anything about how people, was that idea used during the Civil War? I
Oh,
mean,
yeah.
rhetorically, it was.
Origin of Species was published in 1859, and among educated people, the idea spread rapidly. It was cultural dynamite, as well as scientific dynamite. Darwin, incidentally, as I've said or indicated, didn't come up with the idea of evolution. There were evolutionary ideas before. One of them, notably by his grandfather, Erasmus Darwin. What Darwin added was, first of all, a theory, natural selection, and then just massive amounts of evidence for evolution. So those were his additions to a tradition of thinking about evolution, although most scientists certainly rejected the idea. For one reason, it was associated with scientists or a scientist at the time of the French Revolution. If there's one thing the British hated, it was the French Revolution, or just the French in general. So Gettysburg was what, 1863? Well-educated general or officer would have known about it, I imagine. I don't know if they taught it at West Point.
Any more questions? Well, maybe we can go now, and thank you very much, Professor
Thank you.
Glendenning, and come down and visit us.